See, sometimes the greatest failures become the foundation for extraordinary success. What happens when someone who couldn't make it through basic military training finds themselves standing face-to-face with one of the most elite commanders in the U.S. Navy, receiving orders that could change everything? This is the true story of Sarah Martinez, a young woman whose military dreams seemed shattered before they even began, only to discover that her real test was just beginning. In a world where second chances are rare and third chances are nearly impossible, Sarah's journey proves that sometimes the most unlikely paths lead to the most remarkable destinations. Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the scorching Texas heat, sweat dripping down her face as Drill Sergeant Wilson's voice echoed across the training ground like thunder. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her rifle, not from fear of the weapon, but from the crushing realization that she was about to fail at the one thing she had wanted most in her entire life. Fort Benning had been her destination for months before she arrived. Growing up in a small town in Arizona, Sarah had watched her older brother Marcus return from his deployment in Afghanistan with stories that both terrified and inspired her. He spoke of brotherhood, of purpose, of serving something greater than himself. Sarah wanted that feeling more than anything else in the world. She wanted to prove that she was more than just another small-town girl with limited options. The journey to basic training had started 2 years earlier when Sarah graduated high school. Unlike her classmates who headed off to college or settled into local jobs, Sarah had a different vision for her future. She spent months preparing physically, running 5 miles every morning before her shift at the local diner, doing push-ups and sit-ups until her muscles screamed for mercy. She studied military protocol, memorized ranks, and even practiced folding clothes with military precision. Her family thought she was crazy. Her mother, Maria, had cried for weeks when Sarah announced her decision to enlist. Her father, Roberto, had been more supportive but worried about his daughter entering what he still considered a man's world. Even Marcus, the brother who had inspired her military dreams, had tried to talk her out of it. He knew firsthand how brutal the training could be, and he worried that Sarah's determination might not be enough to carry her through. But Sarah had been stubborn, convinced that her preparation and dedication would see her through whatever challenges the military could throw at her. She had signed her enlistment papers with confidence, certain that she was ready for anything. The bus ride to Fort Benning had been filled with excitement and nervous energy as she imagined herself graduating, earning her place among the ranks of soldiers she had admired from afar. The reality of basic training hit her like a physical blow on the very first day. The drill sergeants were relentless, pushing recruits to their absolute limits and beyond. The physical demands were more intense than anything Sarah had experienced, despite her months of preparation. The mental pressure was even worse. Every mistake was magnified, every weakness exposed, and exploited until recruits either found the strength to overcome or crumbled under the weight of expectation. Sarah had started strong, her preparation evident in her performance during the first few weeks. She could keep up with the runs, complete the obstacle courses, and handle the basic weapons training. But as the weeks progressed and the pressure intensified, small cracks began to appear in her confidence. A failed inspection here, a missed target there, and gradually the other recruits began to pull ahead while Sarah found herself struggling to keep pace. The breaking point came during the 4th week of training. The exercise was supposed to be straightforward, a night navigation course through wooded terrain using only a compass and map. Sarah had practiced similar exercises dozens of times, but something went wrong that night. Whether it was the stress, the darkness, or simply a momentary lapse in concentration, she became completely disoriented. What should have been a 2-hour exercise stretched into 6 hours as Sarah wandered through the woods, unable to find her way back to the designated checkpoint. When the search team finally found her at dawn, Sarah was exhausted, dehydrated, and completely demoralized. She had failed not just the exercise, but had put others at risk by forcing them to search for her. The shame was overwhelming, made worse by the disappointed looks from her fellow recruits, and the stern lecture from Drill Sergeant Wilson. The next few days passed in a blur of remedial training and counseling sessions. Sarah tried desperately to prove that the navigation incident was an isolated mistake, but her confidence was shattered. Every subsequent challenge seemed insurmountable. She began second-guessing herself constantly, hesitating when decisiveness was required, stumbling where she had once been sure-footed. The final straw came during a combat simulation exercise. Sarah's unit was tasked with clearing a mock enemy position while under simulated fire. The noise was deafening, smoke filled the air, and the pressure to perform flawlessly was immense. Sarah froze at a critical moment, unable to process the chaos around her. Her hesitation compromised the entire exercise, and her team failed their objective. That evening, Drill Sergeant Wilson called Sarah into his office. The small room felt suffocating as she stood at attention, waiting for what she knew was coming. Wilson was not an unkind man, but he was direct and honest about what he saw. "Martinez," he began, his voice lacking the usual harsh edge she had grown accustomed to, "you came here with heart, and nobody questions your dedication. But heart alone isn't enough in this business. You're not ready for what comes after basic training. You're not ready to be responsible for other people's lives." The words hit Sarah harder than any physical challenge she had faced. She had prepared for the possibility of injury, for exhaustion, for homesickness, but she had never truly prepared for the possibility that she simply wasn't good enough. The military had standards for a reason, and despite her best efforts, she was falling short of those standards. The discharge process was swift and efficient, just like everything else in the military. Within 48 hours, Sarah found herself on a bus heading home to Arizona, her military career over before it had truly begun. She clutched the discharge papers in her hands, the official documentation of her failure feeling heavier than any equipment she had carried during training. The ride home was the longest journey of Sarah's life. Every mile took her further away from her dreams and closer to a future she had never planned for. She thought about facing her family, her friends, the community that had watched her leave with such pride and expectation. How do you explain to people that you simply weren't strong enough, fast enough, or smart enough to succeed at the thing you wanted most? The worst part was the uncertainty. Sarah had built her entire identity around becoming a soldier. Without that goal, she felt lost and directionless. She had no backup plan, no alternative career path that excited her the way military service had. The future that had once seemed so clear and purposeful now appeared frighteningly blank. As the bus pulled into the small Arizona town she had been so eager to leave behind, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. This failure would not define her. Somehow, someway, she would find a path back to the purpose and meaning she had been seeking. She didn't know how or when, but she refused to let this be the end of her story. The bus doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and Sarah stepped out into the familiar desert heat of home, carrying nothing but her duffel bag and a determination to prove that sometimes the biggest failures are just the beginning of the most important journeys. The first few weeks back home were the darkest period of Sarah's life. She moved back in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by high school memories and dreams that now felt naive and foolish. Her parents tried to be supportive, but she could see the disappointment in their eyes, carefully hidden behind forced smiles and overly cheerful conversation. The whole town seemed to know about her failure, whispers following her whenever she ventured out to the grocery store or gas station. Marcus was the only person who understood the depth of her pain. He found her one evening sitting on the back porch, staring out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Without saying a word, he sat down beside her and handed her a beer. They sat in comfortable silence for nearly an hour before he finally spoke. "You know," Marcus said quietly, "failing at basic training doesn't make you a failure as a person. Some of the best soldiers I served with had to take unconventional paths to get where they ended up." Sarah looked at him skeptically, but Marcus continued. There's more than one way to serve, Sarah. The military isn't the only organization that needs people with your kind of determination. That conversation planted a seed in Sarah's mind, though it would be months before it began to grow. In the meantime, she needed to find a way to survive financially and emotionally. She took a job at a local security company, working night shifts at various businesses around town. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave her time to think and space to heal from the trauma of her military failure. During those long, quiet nights walking empty office buildings and warehouse floors, Sarah began to develop skills she hadn't even known she possessed. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings, noticing things others missed. A door that was usually locked but stood slightly ajar, a car parked in an unusual location, the subtle signs that something was not quite right. Her attention to detail, which had failed her under the pressure of basic training, flourished in the calmer environment of security work. 6 months after returning home, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She enrolled in community college, not because she had suddenly developed a passion for academics, but because she had discovered something that captured her interest: criminal justice and cybersecurity. The same analytical skills that had been overwhelmed by the chaos of combat training found their perfect application in understanding how criminals thought and operated. Sarah threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had once brought to military preparation. She excelled in courses on criminal psychology, computer forensics, and investigative techniques. Her professors noticed her unusual dedication and practical approach to problem solving. Unlike many of her classmates who were studying theory, Sarah approached every lesson as if she might need to apply it in real-world situations. Her breakthrough came during a cybersecurity class project. The assignment was theoretical: analyze a simulated corporate network for potential security vulnerabilities. While her classmates produced standard academic papers identifying obvious weaknesses, Sarah went deeper. She not only found vulnerabilities that others had missed, but she mapped out detailed scenarios showing how those weaknesses could be exploited by different types of attackers. Professor Janet Chun was intrigued by Sarah's work and asked her to stay after class. This analysis shows a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond what I typically see from students, Professor Chun said, examining Sarah's project. Have you considered that your skills might be valuable to organizations beyond traditional law enforcement? That conversation led to an internship opportunity that would change Sarah's life trajectory completely. Professor Chun had connections with a private security firm that specialized in protecting high-value targets and sensitive operations. The company needed someone who could think like an attacker while maintaining the discipline and loyalty of a protector. Sarah's unique combination of military training, street-level security experience, and academic knowledge made her an ideal candidate. The internship introduced Sarah to a world she had never known existed. While she had been focused on traditional military service, there was an entire industry of private contractors, security specialists, and protective agents working alongside and sometimes ahead of government forces. These weren't weekend warriors or wannabe soldiers. They were highly trained professionals who had found alternative paths to meaningful service. Sarah's supervisor at the firm was Elena Rodriguez, a former Marine who had transitioned to private security after completing her military service. Elena became both a mentor and a role model, showing Sarah that there were multiple ways to serve and protect others. Under Elena's guidance, Sarah learned advanced surveillance techniques, threat assessment protocols, and crisis management strategies that went far beyond anything taught in basic training. The work was challenging in ways that basic training had never been. Instead of following rigid protocols and responding to shouted commands, Sarah had to think independently, adapt to constantly changing situations, and make split-second decisions based on incomplete information. Paradoxically, the very qualities that had made her struggle in the structured environment of military training made her excel in the fluid world of private security. Sarah's first real assignment came 8 months into her internship. A technology executive had been receiving credible threats from a disgruntled former employee, and the company needed someone to conduct surveillance and assess the threat level. Sarah spent 2 weeks studying the target, mapping his daily routines, identifying potential vulnerabilities, and developing protective protocols. The assignment culminated when Sarah spotted the former employee conducting his own surveillance of the executive's home. Using skills she had learned from Elena and techniques she had developed on her own, Sarah was able to document the stalking behavior and provide evidence that led to the man's arrest before he could carry out any planned attack. The executive was never even aware that he had been in danger, which was exactly how Sarah knew she had done her job correctly. Word of Sarah's success spread through the small but tight-knit community of private security professionals. She began receiving offers for increasingly complex assignments, corporate espionage investigations, executive protection details, and threat assessments for high-profile events. Each assignment taught her something new and built her reputation as someone who could be trusted with sensitive and dangerous work. The transformation was remarkable. The young woman who had failed to complete basic training had become a sought-after professional in a field that demanded many of the same qualities the military valued: discipline, loyalty, strategic thinking, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The difference was that Sarah was now operating in an environment that played to her strengths rather than exposing her weaknesses. 2 years after her discharge from basic training, Sarah received a phone call that would test everything she had learned. Elena's voice was tense when she called Sarah late one evening. "About something unusual," Elena said. "There's a government contract that just came through channels. They're looking for someone with your specific skill set for a classified assignment. The client specifically requested someone with private sector experience, but military background knowledge." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. "What kind of assignment?" "I can't give you details over the phone," Elena replied, "but I can tell you this. It's exactly the kind of work you've been preparing for, and it's important enough that they're willing to overlook conventional hiring practices to get the right person. Are you interested?" Sarah looked around her small apartment, at the certificates from her completed courses, at the commendations from successful assignments, at the evidence of the life she had built from the ashes of her military failure. 3 years earlier, she would have jumped at any chance to return to government service. Now, she was more cautious and thoughtful. "What aren't you telling me, Elena?" There was a pause before Elena answered. "The client is a SEAL commander. He's specifically looking for someone who understands both sides, military protocols and private sector flexibility. Sarah, this could be the opportunity you never knew you were looking for." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her failure at basic training had not been the end of her story after all. It had been the beginning of a journey that had prepared her for something she couldn't have imagined when she first set foot at Fort Benning. Tomorrow, she would find out exactly what that something was. The meeting location was unusual, a small coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, far from any military installation or government building. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, a habit she had developed during her security work, and chose a corner table with clear sight lines to all entrances. She wore simple business casual clothing, nothing that would draw attention, but her trained eyes constantly scanned the environment for anything unusual. At exactly 1,400 hours, a man in his mid-40s entered the coffee shop. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a polo shirt, but something about his posture and the way he moved immediately identified him as military to Sarah's experienced eye. He was average height with graying hair and the kind of lean, efficient build that came from years of intense physical conditioning. His eyes swept the room in the same methodical pattern Sarah had been using, and when they met hers, she knew this was her contact. Commander James Mitchell approached her table with confident strides. He was exactly what Sarah had expected a SEAL commander to look like: calm, controlled, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from leading men in life-or-death situations. When he sat down across from her, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nervousness she had experienced during her basic training evaluations, but this time it was tempered by the confidence she had gained through her private sector work. Ms. Martinez, Commander Mitchell said, his voice carrying the crisp precision of someone accustomed to giving orders that could not be questioned. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I've read your file, both your military record and your civilian accomplishments. Impressive transformation. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the mention of her military record, but she maintained eye contact and replied steadily, "Thank you, sir. Though I'm curious why someone with your credentials would be interested in someone who failed basic training." Mitchell's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a hint of approval in his eyes. Direct. I like that. You're right to question my interest. In my experience, the most valuable people are often those who have overcome significant failures. It tells me something about your character and your adaptability that standard evaluations cannot measure. The commander ordered a black coffee and waited until the server was out of earshot before continuing. I'm going to share some information with you that is classified, but I need you to understand the context of what I'm asking. Are you willing to listen under those terms? Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening with anticipation. 3 weeks ago, the wife of a high-ranking Pentagon official was kidnapped while visiting her sister in Mexico. The kidnappers are not typical criminals looking for ransom. Our intelligence suggests they are connected to a cartel organization that has been targeting military families as part of a broader intimidation campaign against American anti-drug operations. Mitchell paused to take a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as he gauged her reaction to the information. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but her mind was already racing through the implications of what she was hearing. The official channels are compromised, Mitchell continued. We have reason to believe that someone within the government structure is feeding information to the cartel. Every traditional rescue operation we plan seems to be anticipated. We need someone who can operate completely outside normal military and intelligence networks. You need a private contractor, Sarah said, beginning to understand where the conversation was heading. More than that, Mitchell replied. I need someone who understands military thinking, but isn't constrained by military protocols. Someone who has experience with surveillance and threat assessment, but isn't part of any government database that could be accessed by a potential leak. Someone who has proven they can adapt and overcome when traditional approaches fail. Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she realized what Mitchell was describing. Her unique background, which had once seemed like a liability, was exactly what made her valuable for this assignment. Her failure at basic training meant she wasn't in any military personnel system. Her private sector work had given her skills that were applicable, but not traceable through government channels. What exactly are you asking me to do? Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet, setting it on the table between them. The screen showed satellite images of a compound in what appeared to be rural Mexico. The kidnapped woman is being held here, he said, pointing to a cluster of buildings surrounded by high walls. Traditional rescue operations would require massive coordination, helicopter support, and a full team of operators. By the time we could organize something like that through official channels, she'll either be dead or moved to a location we'll never find. Sarah studied the images, her training in threat assessment automatically cataloging the defensive positions, escape routes, and potential vulnerabilities of the compound. You're talking about a direct action mission. That's not exactly my area of expertise. No, but information gathering is. I don't need you to conduct the rescue. I need you to get close enough to confirm she's there, assess the security situation, and provide intelligence that will allow my team to plan an effective operation. You would be operating under civilian cover, using your private sector credentials to get into the area without raising suspicion. The magnitude of what Mitchell was proposing began to sink in. This wasn't a corporate security assignment or a routine surveillance job. This was a covert intelligence operation that could have international implications if something went wrong. Sarah's throat felt dry as she considered the risks involved. Why me specifically? She asked. There have to be intelligence operatives with more experience in this type of work. Mitchell's expression grew more serious. Because this operation doesn't officially exist. If it goes wrong, if you're captured or killed, there will be no government support, no diplomatic intervention, no acknowledgement that you're working for us. You would be completely on your own, with only your private sector credentials to protect you. I need someone who understands that reality and is willing to accept it anyway. Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the decision before her. This was the opportunity Marcus had predicted might come, the chance to serve in a way that traditional military service could never offer. But it was also potentially a death sentence if anything went wrong. What kind of timeline are we talking about? The intelligence suggests she has maybe a week before they move her or eliminate her as a liability. You would need to be in Mexico within 48 hours, establish your cover, and begin surveillance operations immediately. Sarah thought about her current life, the security assignments she would have to abandon, the risks she would be taking for someone she had never met. But she also thought about the woman who was depending on strangers to save her life, and about the opportunity to prove that her unconventional path had led somewhere meaningful. If I agree to this, I need complete autonomy in the field. I work alone, I make my own decisions about how to gather the intelligence, and I extract on my timeline, not yours. Mitchell nodded slowly. Agreed. But understand that once you cross that border, you're operating in a completely different world. The people holding this woman have killed federal agents, tortured informants, and eliminated entire families across them. If they discover what you're doing, your private sector experience won't be enough to save you. Sarah looked at the satellite images again, studying the compound that would either make her career or end her life. She thought about the young woman who had failed basic training, about all the people who had written her off as not tough enough for real military service. This was her chance to prove them wrong in a way that mattered more than any graduation ceremony or promotion could. When do I leave? Mitchell smiled for the first time since sitting down. Tomorrow night. Elena Rodriguez will provide you with your cover story and equipment. Sarah, I want you to understand something. What I'm asking you to do requires exactly the kind of independent thinking and adaptability that made traditional military service difficult for you. Your failure at basic training isn't a liability for this mission. It's precisely what makes you the right person for the job. As they left the coffee shop separately, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration unlike anything she had experienced since her early days of basic training. The difference was that this time, she was walking into a situation that demanded her unique skills rather than exposing her weaknesses. In less than 36 hours, she would cross into Mexico with a cover story and a mission that could save a life or cost her own. Either way, she would finally know whether all her preparation and experience had been leading toward this moment. Sarah's cover story was simple, but carefully crafted. She was a freelance photographer documenting rural Mexican communities for a travel magazine. The story provided justification for her presence in remote areas, explained any camera equipment or surveillance gear she might be carrying, and gave her a reason to ask questions about local landmarks and buildings. Elena had worked with a contact to establish a paper trail that would hold up to casual scrutiny, complete with a portfolio of previous work and magazine credentials. The border crossing at Nogales went smoothly, just another American tourist heading into Mexico with a backpack and camera gear. Sarah had memorized every detail of her cover identity during the 6-hour drive from Phoenix, practicing responses to potential questions until they felt natural. Her Spanish was fluent, a skill she had developed growing up in Arizona, and she knew enough about photography to maintain her cover under casual questioning. The town of Esperanza was 2 hours south of the border, a dusty community of maybe 3,000 people surrounded by desert and low mountains. It was exactly the kind of place where strangers were noticed, which made Sarah's mission both easier and more dangerous. People would remember her presence, but they would also talk about anything unusual they observed in the area. Sarah checked into a small hotel on the main square, a family-run establishment that had probably seen better days, but maintained the kind of authentic character that would appeal to her supposed magazine assignment. The proprietor, an elderly man named Carlos, was friendly and helpful, proud to have a foreign journalist interested in documenting his community. "What brings you to Esperanza?" Carlos asked in Spanish as he showed her to her room. "Most tourists go to the coast, or the cities? I'm interested in authentic Mexican communities, Sarah replied, testing her cover story. Places where traditional life continues unchanged. Your town has exactly the kind of character my readers want to see. Carlos beamed with pride. You should speak with my nephew Miguel. He knows all the history of the area, all the old families, and their stories. And if you want to photograph the countryside, he can guide you to the most beautiful locations. Sarah accepted the offer gratefully, recognizing that a local guide would provide both credibility for her cover and potentially valuable intelligence about the surrounding area. That evening, she met Miguel in the hotel's small restaurant. He was in his mid-20s, college-educated, but unable to find work in his field, making ends meet by doing odd jobs around town. Over dinner, Sarah gradually steered the conversation toward her real objective. I'm particularly interested in photographing traditional haciendas or ranch compounds, she said casually. The kind of places that show how wealthy families lived in the old days. Miguel's expression changed slightly, becoming more guarded. There are some old places in the hills, he said carefully, but most are abandoned or owned by people who don't welcome visitors. Sarah pressed gently. Even abandoned places can make wonderful photographs. The contrast between past grandeur and present decay tells its own story. Miguel was quiet for a moment, apparently wrestling with something. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke in a lower voice. There's a place about 20 kilometers north of town. It used to belong to a cattle baron, very wealthy family. But now, he shrugged. Different people own it now. People who value their privacy very much. Could you show me where it is? Even if we can't get close, I might be able to photograph it from a distance. Miguel's hesitation was obvious. These new owners, they don't like photographers or tourists or anyone asking questions. It would be better to find other subjects for your magazine. Sarah recognized the fear in Miguel's voice and realized she had found her target. The compound Mitchell had shown her was clearly known to the locals as a place to avoid. She decided not to push further that evening, instead spending time building rapport with Miguel and gathering general information about the area's geography and roads. The next morning, Sarah set out alone despite Miguel's offer to guide her to safer photographic locations. She had memorized the satellite images of the compound and used her tablet to navigate the network of dirt roads that led into the hills north of Esperanza. Her cover story held up at the few checkpoints she encountered. Local police were accustomed to occasional tourists and showed little interest in her photography equipment. The compound was situated in a valley between two low ridges, exactly as the satellite images had indicated. From her position on a hillside approximately 1 kilometer away, Sarah could observe the entire facility through her camera's telephoto lens. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the mission's difficulty. The compound was much larger than the satellite images had suggested, with multiple buildings arranged around a central courtyard. High concrete walls topped with razor wire surrounded the entire facility, and Sarah counted at least 6 guards stationed at various positions around the perimeter. 2 guard towers provided elevated observation posts that would make any approach extremely difficult. Sarah spent the entire day in observation, carefully documenting the guards' routines, noting shift changes, and mapping the layout of the compound. She used her camera's legitimate functions to take cover photographs of the surrounding landscape, while simultaneously gathering intelligence through the telephoto lens. By evening, she had a complete picture of the facility's external security arrangements. The challenge was confirming whether the kidnapped woman was actually inside. Sarah needed to get much closer to the compound, close enough to observe the interior buildings and potentially identify specific individuals. The problem was that such an approach would be virtually impossible during daylight hours, and night operations would be even more dangerous given the guard coverage and the remote location. That evening, back in Esperanza, Sarah made contact with Mitchell through an encrypted communication system Elena had provided. The secure connection allowed her to transmit photographs and intelligence reports without risking interception by local authorities or cartel communications monitoring. Mitchell's response was immediate and concerned. The security is heavier than our intelligence indicated. Are you certain about the guard count? Positive, Sarah replied. At least 6 exterior guards, probably more inside the compound. Professional setup, military-style discipline. These aren't typical cartel foot soldiers. Understood. We're dealing with a higher level of organization than expected. Can you confirm the target's presence without compromising your position? Sarah had been dreading that question. Confirming the woman's presence would require getting close enough to observe the interior buildings, which meant penetrating the compound's security perimeter. It was exactly the kind of direct action operation she had told Mitchell was outside her expertise. "I'll need to get inside the perimeter," she typed back. "That's going to be high risk." Negative. Do not attempt penetration. Your safety is the priority. If you can't confirm from external observation, we'll have to proceed with incomplete intelligence. Sarah stared at the screen, knowing that incomplete intelligence would make any rescue operation exponentially more dangerous for Mitchell's team. They would be going in blind, not knowing the exact location of the hostage or the full extent of the security arrangements. The mission's failure rate would be unacceptably high, and the kidnapped woman would likely die as a result. She thought about the conversation in the coffee shop, about Mitchell's confidence in her abilities, and about the woman whose life depended on the quality of intelligence she could provide. Sarah had spent years developing skills that were specifically designed for exactly this kind of situation. If she couldn't gather the information needed to save an innocent life, what had all her training and experience been for? Against Mitchell's direct orders and every tactical principle she had learned, Sarah made the decision that would either vindicate her unconventional path to this moment or end her life in the Mexican desert. She was going to penetrate the compound's security perimeter and confirm the hostage's presence, regardless of the personal risk involved. The next morning, she sent Miguel home early and began preparing for what would either be the most successful intelligence operation of her career or her final mission. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Esperanza, Sarah checked her equipment one last time and began the drive that would take her back to the compound for a nighttime approach that violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. But sometimes she reflected as the lights of the town disappeared behind her. The most important missions required exactly the kind of independent judgment that had made traditional military service impossible for her. Sarah parked her rental car 3 kilometers from the compound, hidden behind a cluster of rocks that would shield it from casual observation. The desert night was surprisingly cold, and she pulled on dark clothing that would help her blend into the shadows. Her equipment was minimal by design: night vision goggles, a small camera with infrared capability, basic communication gear, and a sidearm that she hoped she would never need to use. The approach to the compound took nearly 2 hours of careful movement across rough terrain. Sarah had studied the guard rotations during her daylight observation and identified a window of opportunity when the northeastern section of the perimeter would have minimal coverage. The timing had to be perfect. She would have approximately 15 minutes to reach the compound wall, gather intelligence, and begin her withdrawal before the guards completed their rotation. As she moved through the darkness, Sarah felt a strange calmness settling over her. This was nothing like the chaos and pressure of basic training. There were no drill sergeants shouting orders, no artificial time constraints, no arbitrary rules that had to be followed regardless of their practical value. This was pure problem-solving, the kind of independent operation that played to every strength she had developed over the past 3 years. The compound's outer wall was 12 feet high, topped with razor wire that glinted in the starlight. Sarah had anticipated this obstacle and brought climbing gear appropriately disguised as photography equipment. She found a section where shadows from an overhanging tree provided additional concealment and began her ascent. The wall proved to be the easiest part of the infiltration. Sarah's private sector training had included technical climbing and rappelling, skills that were directly applicable to this situation. Within minutes, she was crouched on top of the wall, using her night vision equipment to survey the compound's interior. What she saw exceeded her worst expectations. The compound was laid out like a military installation, with separate buildings for different functions and clear sight lines between guard positions. She counted at least 10 armed guards patrolling the interior, moving in patterns that suggested professional training and discipline. This was not a hastily organized kidnapping operation. It was a sophisticated detention facility designed to hold high-value prisoners. Sarah identified the building most likely to house prisoners, a single-story structure with barred windows and only one entrance, positioned at the center of the compound where it could be easily monitored from multiple guard positions. Getting close enough to confirm the hostage's presence would require crossing 40 meters of open ground with minimal cover. Using techniques she had learned during her security work, Sarah began a methodical infiltration of the compound's interior. She moved from shadow to shadow, timing her movements to coincide with the guards' patrol patterns, using every available piece of cover to avoid detection. The process was painstakingly slow, but her patience was rewarded when she reached a position near the suspected detention building. Through a barred window, Sarah could see into a small room lit by a single overhead bulb. A woman in her mid-30s sat on a narrow cot, her clothing dirty but intact, her posture suggesting exhaustion rather than serious injury. Sarah recognized her immediately from the photographs Mitchell had provided. This was definitely the kidnapped Pentagon official's wife. The woman appeared to be unguarded at the moment, though Sarah could hear voices from other parts of the building that suggested the presence of additional security personnel. She used her camera to document the woman's condition and location, gathering photographic evidence that would be crucial for planning any rescue operation. As Sarah prepared to begin her withdrawal, she heard voices approaching the detention building. 2 guards were conducting what appeared to be a routine security check, their conversation casual but alert. Sarah pressed herself against the building's wall, hoping the shadows would provide sufficient concealment. The guards passed within 3 meters of her position, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and hear every word of their conversation. They were discussing plans to move the prisoner the following evening, destination unknown but described as permanent solution, in terms that left no doubt about their intentions. The woman had less than 24 hours to live unless something changed dramatically. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the implications of what she had overheard. Mitchell's team would need this information immediately if they had any hope of conducting a rescue operation before the deadline. But first, she had to extract from the compound without being detected, a challenge that was about to become significantly more difficult. As she began moving away from the detention building, one of the guards returned unexpectedly, apparently having forgotten something during his security check. He walked directly towards Sarah's position, flashlight in hand, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the compound's layout intimately. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. She could attempt to hide and hope the guard didn't spot her, risking capture and torture if the concealment failed. She could attempt to neutralize the guard silently, but that would likely raise an alarm when he failed to report in. Or she could create a distraction that might allow her to escape during the confusion. In that moment of crisis, all the confidence and adaptability Sarah had developed over the past 3 years crystallized into pure instinct. She threw a small rock toward a section of the compound 30 meters away, creating just enough noise to suggest an animal or piece of debris had fallen. The guard immediately turned toward the sound, giving Sarah the opening she needed to sprint toward the perimeter wall. The next few minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She moved faster than she had ever moved before, using every technique she had learned about stealth and evasion, pushing her physical conditioning to its absolute limits. Behind her, she could hear increased activity as the guards investigated the disturbance, but no alarm had been raised yet. Sarah reached the wall just as her 15-minute window was closing. The climb back over the razor wire seemed to take forever, every second increasing the risk that she would be spotted by the returning guards. When she finally dropped to the ground on the outside of the compound, she wanted to collapse with relief, but she knew the extraction phase was just beginning. The retreat to her vehicle was conducted at a pace that left her physically exhausted, but alive and undetected. By dawn, she was back in Esperanza, uploading intelligence reports and photographs to Mitchell through the encrypted communication system. The information she had gathered would provide everything needed for a successful rescue operation, assuming Mitchell could organize his team in time to meet the deadline. Mitchell's response came within 2 hours. Outstanding work. Intel exactly what we needed. Team deploying immediately. You are ordered to evacuate the area immediately and return to the U.S. Your part of the mission is complete. Sarah stared at the message, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. She had completed her assigned task successfully, proving that her unique background and unconventional training path had led to exactly the kind of capability Mitchell needed. The mission's success would save an innocent woman's life and provide closure to a family that had been living in terror. But as she packed her equipment and prepared to leave Esperanza, Sarah realized that this mission had changed her fundamentally. She had discovered that the qualities that made traditional military service difficult for her, the independence and adaptability that had caused problems in basic training, were exactly the attributes that made her valuable for the most important and dangerous assignments. 3 days later, back in her Arizona apartment, Sarah received a secure phone call from Mitchell. The rescue operation had been completely successful. The hostage had been recovered alive and unharmed, and the intelligence Sarah had provided had been so accurate that the SEAL team had encountered no unexpected obstacles or resistance. The woman was already back home with her family, and the cartel operatives responsible for the kidnapping were either dead or in custody. "Sarah," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent during their initial meeting, "I want you to know that what you accomplished down there goes far beyond what most trained intelligence operatives could have achieved. Your performance under pressure, your tactical judgment, and your ability to adapt to unexpected situations were exceptional." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "Thank you, sir. It was an honor to be able to help." "There's something else," Mitchell continued. "I've been authorized to offer you a position as a civilian contractor with a joint military intelligence task force. We have ongoing operations that require exactly your skill set and background. The work would be similar to what you just completed, but with better support and significantly better compensation." Sarah looked around her apartment, at the life she had built from the ruins of her military failure, at the certificates and commendations that represented her journey from basic training dropout to accomplished security professional. The offer represented everything she had ever wanted: meaningful service, challenging work, and the opportunity to use her abilities in ways that mattered. "I'm interested," she said finally, "but I need to understand something first. Will I be working within traditional military command structures, or will I have the autonomy to operate according to my own judgment?" Mitchell's laughter was warm and understanding. "Sarah, if I wanted someone who could follow traditional military command structures, I would use traditional military personnel. What makes you valuable is exactly your ability to think and operate independently. You would have complete tactical autonomy within the strategic parameters of each mission." 6 months later, Sarah found herself in a briefing room in a classified location, receiving mission parameters for an operation in Eastern Europe. Around the table were other civilian contractors, each with unconventional backgrounds that had led them to this specialized form of service. She was no longer the failed basic training recruit or the small-town security guard trying to find her place in the world. Sarah Martinez had become exactly what she had always been meant to be: a highly skilled professional who served her country in ways that traditional military service could never have accommodated. Her failure at basic training had not been the end of her military dreams. It had been the beginning of a journey that led to opportunities she had never imagined possible. As the briefing began and she learned details of her next assignment, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. Sometimes the greatest failures really do become the foundation for extraordinary success, and sometimes the most unlikely paths lead to exactly where you were always meant to be.